What if everything you've been told about the pyramids is a lie? Not just a few details here and there, but the entire foundation of the story. What if the monuments we've been taught to see as the pinnacle of ancient Egypt's achievement are in truth the weathered leftovers of a civilization so old its name has been erased from the human record? Think about that for a second. Stone blocks older than the pharaohs, weathered by rains that haven't touched the Sahara in over 7,000 years. If that's even possible, then we're not just talking about rewriting a chapter of history, we're talking about burning the whole book and starting over. For centuries, the official narrative has been neatly packaged. 4th dynasty kings, 4,500 years ago, ordering the construction of the pyramids as their eternal tombs. But stones don't care about official narratives. They bear their own scars. They show weather patterns that don't match the climate of Khufu's time, tool marks that shouldn't be possible with copper chisels, and alignments to stars in a sky that no Egyptian in 2500 BCE would have seen. The Giza plateau might not be a construction site of one era at all, but the palimpsest of many layer upon layer of building, erasing, reclaiming, and recarving across thousands of years. Ask yourself this: how many facts about ancient Egypt are based on inscriptions that could have been added long after the stone was set in place? How many names and dates are painted on history's canvas, while the original picture lies buried underneath? Beneath the plateau, there are unexplored chambers, flooded tunnels, and entire magnetic anomalies we can't explain without excavation. And above ground there are blocks whose geological origin doesn't even match Giza's bedrock, silent imports from somewhere or someone else. Tonight we're going to strip away the neat, comfortable story. We'll talk about erosion from ancient rains, star shafts aimed at a sky 8,000 years older than the textbooks allow, buried harbors for a river that no longer exists, and chambers sealed so tightly that no modern human has ever breathed their air. If the official version is correct, these are fascinating quirks. If it's wrong, they're the fingerprints of an older humanity, one that may have been building in stone when the Sahara was still green and hippos swam in the Nile's wide floodplains. This is secrets buried beneath the pyramids. And if I'm right, we might be looking not at Egypt's first monuments, but at the last survivors of a civilization we've forgotten how to remember. 20. The Hall of the Hidden Chambers. Beneath the towering weight of the Great Pyramid, there may still be spaces that have never felt human breath in thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years. Official surveys tell us the structure is well mapped, but every decade or so, new technologies reveal cavities and voids that no explorer has ever reached. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project used muon radiography, cosmic particles passing through stone, to detect a massive, unexplained void above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long. Officially, it is labeled an architectural anomaly, a relieving space, or simply an unfinished chamber. But what if it is neither? Historians are still debating whether the void might be a relic from an earlier phase of construction, perhaps a chamber sealed deliberately and inherited by the builders of Khufu's age. Such a space could contain tools, inscriptions, or even organic material from an era predating dynastic Egypt, evidence that might reset the entire timeline of human civilization. Odd fact: similar hidden rooms have been discovered in other ancient structures, from Mayan temples in Mexico to burial mounds in Japan, often containing items untouched since their sealing. If such a cache lies within Giza, modern non-invasive scans may be the only way to find it without destabilizing the structure. The pyramid's sheer scale means hundreds of meters of corridors and internal architecture remain untested with the latest imaging. Micro-robotics, endoscopic cameras, and even miniature drones have been proposed to explore the narrow, mysterious shafts leading away from the Queen's chamber, shafts that end in doors with copper fittings, a detail oddly elaborate for features that go nowhere. Were these blocked intentionally to hide something, and if so, from whom? If these sealed chambers are relics from a much older pyramid core, their contents might be more than archaeological. They could be the only surviving artifacts of a vanished civilization, locked in the dark while empires rose and fell above them. Until the right tools and the right political will align, they will remain silent, buried within the most famous building in the world. 19. The subterranean labyrinth. Beneath the plateau, far below the desert floor, beyond the base of the visible pyramids, lies another Egypt, one of tunnels, cisterns, and flooded chambers. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a labyrinth under the plateau, so vast that it rivaled the pyramids themselves in grandeur. He claimed it contained halls, courtyards, and rooms filled with carvings. While many historians dismiss this as travelers' exaggeration, modern ground-penetrating radar has indeed detected anomalous voids beneath Giza, some large enough to suggest man-made structures. In 2008, Egyptian archaeologists confirmed the existence of an enormous catacomb complex near the Sphinx, though much of it was flooded with groundwater. Odd fact: Ancient flood basins and cisterns in the region still hold water even in the modern hyper-arid climate, fed by deep aquifers that may have been tapped millennia ago. Historians are still debating whether the subterranean network was primarily functional, water storage, quarry tunnels, or ceremonial, perhaps an underworld counterpart to the pyramids above. The fact that much of it remains unexplored fuels speculation that its origins may precede Khufu's reign entirely. If the labyrinth predates the visible monuments, it could hold the clearest geological evidence of an earlier Nile climate, along with artifacts sealed in silt since the last African humid period. Ancient texts hint at hidden records stored below ground, to protect them from both man and flood. Whether those records were clay tablets, scrolls, or carved stone is unknown, but if they exist, they could rewrite the history of early humanity. The irony is that water, Egypt's lifeblood, has kept explorers from reaching these depths. Even now, certain lower shafts are too waterlogged for safe entry, and their contents remain preserved in total darkness, waiting for a generation of archaeologists willing to dive beneath the sands in search of what lies below. 18. The enigmatic star shafts and celestial locks. The Great Pyramid contains 4 narrow shafts, 2 from the king's chamber and 2 from the queen's, whose original purpose remains one of Egyptology's most enduring riddles. They are too small for human passage, angled steeply, and aimed not at random, but towards specific points in the ancient sky. The southern shaft from the king's chamber pointed toward Orion's belt, around 2500 BCE, while the northern aligned with the pole star of that era, Thuban and Draco. The queen's chamber shafts were blocked at their ends by limestone slabs with copper fittings, features so unusual that they are often called doors despite opening to nothing. In 1993, a robotic camera sent up one of these shafts revealed a sealed block with those copper handles, and in 2011, another robot found hieroglyph-like markings on the backside of the slab, symbols that have never been made public in full detail. Historians are still debating whether these shafts were symbolic passages for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the stars, or whether they had a practical astronomical function, perhaps as sighting tubes for rituals, or even as a form of stellar calendar. Odd fact, if extended backward in time, the shaft's alignments suggest a perfect match to star positions not in 2500 BCE, but around 10,500 BCE, when Orion and Leo, the Sphinx's counterpart in the sky, rose together at the spring equinox. This tantalizing correlation fuels theories that the shafts were inherited from an older structure aligned to a much earlier sky. If true, then the doors may be more than symbolic. They could be ancient celestial locks, sealing the old system after its alignment no longer matched the heavens. Opening them fully may not just reveal an empty space, but a hidden chamber containing the last surviving artifacts of that earlier astronomical age, a silent record of a people who measured time in the slow procession of the stars. 17. The buried harbor and the lost river route. If the pyramids were built, or at least begun, long before the Old Kingdom, their construction may have relied on a Nile that looked very different from today's. Geological surveys suggest that during wetter periods, a branch of the river flowed much closer to the Giza plateau than it does now, possibly lapping right at its base. This proximity would have allowed massive stone blocks to be floated nearly to the worksite on large barges, reducing the need for long overland transport. In 2012, archaeologists uncovered evidence of ancient harbor structures near Giza, including basin-like formations and channels that could date back thousands of years before Khufu. Odd fact, sediment cores taken in the area show pollen and aquatic plant remains from species that have not grown there for over 5,000 years, indicating a much wetter navigable environment. Historians are still debating whether these harbor features were used exclusively during the Old Kingdom, or whether they were reactivations of far older infrastructure. If the latter, then the pyramid harbor may have been part of a sophisticated transport system in an earlier era, perhaps linking Giza to quarries and settlements now lost beneath the Nile Delta or Mediterranean Sea. Such a system could explain how multi-ton granite beams from Aswan were moved with relative ease compared to purely overland hauling. Imagine the sight, fleets of long, shallow draft boats gliding down a broad Nile channel, stacked with colossal stones, moving silently toward the plateau. If those channels are still buried beneath modern Cairo, or under meters of silt, they may hold timbers, ropes, and tools preserved in anaerobic mud. These could be the only surviving physical link between the pyramids and a vanished Nile civilization, evidence that, like the stones themselves, has been hiding in plain sight under the flow of the river for millennia. The shadow of an older sphinx. The sphinx is often described as Khafre's monument, carved around 2500 BCE to guard his pyramid complex, but there are signs that its body, and possibly its head, are much older. Geological studies of the Sphinx enclosure show deep vertical fissures and undulating weathering patterns consistent with centuries of heavy rainfall, something that last occurred in Egypt thousands of years before Khafre's time. This has led some researchers, most famously geologist Robert Schoch, to propose a date as early as 7000–9000 BCE. Odd fact, the Sphinx's head is disproportionately small compared to its body, suggesting it may have been recarved from a larger, more weathered head in antiquity. If true, the original could have been an entirely different figure, possibly a lion, in keeping with the constellation Leo's position on the horizon, around 10,500 BCE. Historians are still debating whether the Old Kingdom Egyptians found an already ancient monument on the plateau and reshaped it to match their own royal iconography. If so, the Sphinx would be the most visible survivor of a pre-dynastic monumental tradition, its original face and purpose lost under thousands of years of political repurposing. This theory gains weight from the discovery of erosion patterns on nearby structures, like the Sphinx Temple, that match those on the Sphinx itself. These temples use blocks quarried from around the Sphinx's body, meaning they share the same weathering history and possibly the same ancient origin. If we could strip away the later modifications, we might see a very different guardian staring out over the plateau, one whose gaze was fixed not on Khafre's pyramid, but on a Nile that ran higher, a Sahara that bloomed green, and a sky where Leo rose in glory at the equinox. To accept such an age for the Sphinx is to accept that Egypt's most iconic monuments are merely the last chapter in a much older story, a story whose first pages are still buried beneath the sands. 15. The weathered temples of forgotten gods. At the base of the Sphinx lie two structures often overlooked by casual visitors, the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple. Built from titanic limestone blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, these temples fit together with a precision that makes modern masons blink in disbelief. Many of these blocks were quarried from the bedrock immediately surrounding the Sphinx itself, meaning they share the same deep, rounded erosion patterns caused by long-term water exposure. This suggests they were built during a wetter period, perhaps thousands of years before the official timeline places them. Historians are still debating whether these temples were part of Khafre's building program, or if they were already ancient when he ruled. Odd fact, the granite facing on the Valley Temple is of such high polish that even today, the seams between blocks are nearly invisible, an achievement difficult to replicate without advanced tools. If the limestone cores of these temples predate the Old Kingdom, it raises the possibility that the original complex around the Sphinx was not a funerary site at all, but a ceremonial or astronomical center aligned to a very different sky. Imagine approaching the Sphinx Temple in its prime, not the weathered ruin we see today, but gleaming with fresh granite, its immense doorway framing the horizon where the equinox sun rose in perfect alignment. If this vision belongs to an earlier age, it would mean that Khafre and his builders did not create the complex from scratch. They inherited it, refurbished it, and inscribed their names upon it, as countless rulers have done with monuments whose origins they no longer understood. This would also explain why these temples feel so different from later Old Kingdom works in both scale and style. They may be survivors from a time when Egypt was wetter, greener, and home to a culture with a mastery of stonework that would fade into legend. 14. The Lost Pyramid, Beneath the Sands. For centuries, rumors have persisted of a fourth pyramid at Giza, smaller than the others, but built of a material unlike any known in the complex. The 19th century explorer Frederick Norden described seeing it, noting that it appeared to be made of a darker stone, possibly basalt. By the early 20th century, no trace of it remained above ground, leading many to dismiss Norden's account as error or exaggeration. But satellite imagery has revealed subtle geometric anomalies beneath the sand south of the Menkaure Pyramid, shapes that could be buried foundations. Historians are still debating whether these shapes are natural rock formations, the remains of a dismantled structure, or the buried core of a pyramid, whose casing was stripped away long ago. Odd fact, basalt is an extremely durable volcanic stone, much harder than the limestone used for the main pyramids. The basalt pavement found at Khufu's mortuary temple still bears tool marks, despite being over 4,500 years old. If the fourth pyramid existed, and was built largely of basalt, it could have survived in better condition beneath the sands than a limestone structure would. The question is, why would such a pyramid be dismantled, or buried? If it predates the others, perhaps it fell out of use, its stone recycled for other monuments. Or perhaps it was intentionally concealed in a later age, when its existence threatened the official narrative of the pharaohs as the first and greatest pyramid builders. If excavated, it might reveal architectural techniques or materials unseen elsewhere at Giza, pointing to a different cultural origin. Until someone digs deep enough, it will remain one of the plateau's most tantalizing shadows, a monument that may still be sleeping under its own private dune. 13. The foundation of an age before pharaohs. Beneath every pyramid lies a foundation, layers of stone and earth prepared to bear millions of tons of weight. At Giza, these foundations have been cut directly into the bedrock, with astonishing flatness, in some places so precise that modern laser levels detect variations of less than a centimeter over tens of meters. This kind of precision is rare, even in later Egyptian works, suggesting that the builders of the foundation may have had surveying skills equal to or greater than those of the pyramid's visible layers. Odd fact, beneath the Great Pyramid, archaeologists have found traces of earlier leveling cuts, channels and slots that serve no function in the current design, as if the base was prepared for a different structure entirely before Khufu's pyramid was begun. Historians are still debating whether these features are simply part of the known construction process, or remnants of an earlier monument dismantled or reworked by the Old Kingdom builders. If the latter, the pyramids may literally rest upon the footprints of a forgotten age. The geological strata beneath the plateau also tell a story, layers of compacted sediment and fossilized marine life, from a time when the Nile Valley was under shallow seas, overlain by soils that speak of wetter, greener millennia. If these foundations were laid during such a period, their precision may have been achieved with techniques adapted to a landscape richer in resources than the arid plateau we see today. Imagine the first builders arriving on a lush rise above the river's floodplain, marking out alignments not just to the cardinal points but to the stars, carving channels to guide rainwater away from the base, and leaving a level platform that would outlast their culture. When the pharaohs came, they would have found it ready, an ancient canvas on which to paint their own ambitions. 12. The stone that shouldn't be there. Among the millions of limestone blocks making up the pyramids, there are occasional outliers, stones that don't match the surrounding geology at all. In certain courses of Khufu's pyramid, researchers have documented blocks whose fossil content and mineral composition indicate they came from quarries far from Giza, some over 500 kilometers away. Moving such heavy stone across ancient Egypt would have been a feat in itself, but the mystery deepens when you consider their placement, scattered irregularly, often buried deep within the core where no one would ever see them. Historians are still debating whether these exotic stones were intentional, perhaps remnants of an older monument dismantled and incorporated into the new structure, or simply the result of using whatever material was at hand during construction. Odd fact, similar intrusive blocks appear in megalithic sites elsewhere, like Stonehenge's bluestones, which were transported from Wales to southern England for reasons that remain unknown. If the foreign stones at Giza were reused from earlier sacred sites, they may carry inscriptions or tool marks invisible under their weathered surfaces. Petrographic analysis could one day reveal not only their origin but the technology used to cut and shape them. Imagine what it would mean if one of those deep core blocks turned out to be older than the rest of the pyramid by thousands of years, a literal fossil of an earlier architectural tradition buried within the walls. Such a discovery could prove that the builders of Khufu's pyramid were not starting from scratch, but inheriting both knowledge and materials from a culture whose works no longer stand above the sand. Until the inner core is more thoroughly studied, these stray stones remain silent, hitchhikers in the great voyage of Giza's history. 11. The map hidden in the floor beneath the feet of the few who are allowed into the pyramid's subterranean chamber lies one of Giza's least discussed features, a roughly hewn floor with channels, niches and depressions carved directly into the bedrock. Unlike the precision of the pyramid above, this chamber feels raw, almost unfinished, as though it belonged to a different project entirely. Some researchers suggest it was an earlier tomb abandoned when plans changed. Others think it may have been symbolic, representing the underworld in the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. But a minority of scholars have proposed something far stranger, that the layout of the chamber's floor is a kind of map, echoing topographic features of the surrounding Nile Valley. Odd fact, when mapped in detail, the chamber's grooves and depressions do bear a loose resemblance to the river's course and its tributaries during wetter climatic periods. Historians are still debating whether such a resemblance is coincidence, symbolic representation, or intentional record. If it is intentional, it would suggest a level of geographic surveying and planning at a time when most cultures were barely moving beyond subsistence agriculture. More intriguingly, it could mean the builders were recording a Nile that flowed differently than it does today, offering geological evidence of a vastly altered landscape. Imagine the floor as a 3D memory, a carved reminder of a floodplain that sustained a people long before the desert took hold. If this interpretation is correct, then the subterranean chamber is not just an odd basement, it's the oldest physical map on Earth, hidden under the world's most famous monument. 10. The pyramid's lost apex. Every pyramid at Giza once ended not in a flat plateau, but in a gleaming capstone, the pyramid and polished to catch the first light of dawn and the last rays of sunset. None of the original pyramidions survive on their monuments today, but fragments of later examples show they were often made of granite or basalt, sometimes covered in electrum, a gold-silver alloy that would have shone brilliantly. The missing apex of the Great Pyramid is one of archaeology's most evocative absences. Historians are still debating whether it was removed in antiquity, lost to earthquake damage, or deliberately taken down during the Middle Ages to harvest its precious metal coating. Odd fact: ancient texts described capstones inscribed with mysterious symbols, possibly astronomical data, sacred formulas, or even records of the monument's builders. If the Great Pyramid's original pyramidion still exists somewhere buried in the sands, broken in a temple cache, or lying unrecognized in a museum storeroom, it could hold the only contemporary inscription definitively linking the monument to its creator, whether Khufu or someone far earlier. Some fringe researchers go further, suggesting the pyramidion could have had a functional role, perhaps in focusing light or energy, an idea dismissed by mainstream archaeology but persistent in popular speculation. Imagine standing at dawn in an earlier age, watching that perfect stone ignite in the sun's first blaze, visible for miles around, a daily cosmic alignment between earth and sky. Its absence today is more than architectural, it's symbolic, a missing crown that leaves the pyramid both unfinished and eternal, inviting us to wonder not only where it went, but what it once meant to those who placed it there. 9. The encrypted geometry of the base. Beneath the visible grandeur of the Great Pyramid lies its most underestimated secret, the ground plan itself. The pyramid's base is almost perfectly square, with an error margin of just a few centimeters over 230 meters per side. But the proportions of this base are more than an exercise in precision. They encode mathematical relationships that shouldn't have been possible for a Bronze Age civilization to calculate without advanced tools. Historians are still debating whether these proportions are deliberate or coincidental, but when the height of the pyramid, in its original complete form, is compared to the perimeter of its base, the ratio closely approximates 2 pi, effectively turning the structure into a stone model of the northern hemisphere of Earth, at a scale of 1/43,200. Odd fact: this same scale is the one later used by modern cartography to map the planet's circumference. Critics of this interpretation argue that such coincidences can be found in many ancient structures if you look hard enough, but others suggest the builders may have possessed a legacy of geodetic knowledge from an earlier culture that had measured the Earth with extraordinary accuracy, knowledge that would only be rediscovered in the modern era. Imagine standing on the plateau thousands of years ago, the pyramid's edges aligned perfectly to true north, its proportions silently encoding the planet's dimensions, the whole structure acting as a geophysical marker, visible from miles away. If the geometry was intentional, then it means the builders were not simply stacking stones, they were embedding a dataset about the Earth itself into the most enduring monument in human history. And if it was a legacy from a forgotten age, the Great Pyramid may be not only a tomb, not only a temple, but the oldest surviving textbook on the scale and shape of our world. 8. The fossil code in the limestone. Every limestone block of the Great Pyramid is a page from an ancient ocean's archive. The Giza plateau was once the seabed of the Tethys Ocean, and embedded in its stone are millions of fossilized shells, corals, and microscopic marine creatures. Most visitors never notice them, but up close, the blocks reveal spiral mollusks, coral branches, and tiny skeletons frozen in rock for 30 million years. Odd fact: geologists have identified specific fossil species in the pyramid's blocks that match only certain strata of the plateau's bedrock, strata that in some cases are absent from the areas officially recorded as quarries for Khufu's project. This raises the question, were some of these blocks brought from elsewhere, perhaps reused from an older structure, whose quarry source has since eroded away, or lies buried? Historians are still debating whether the fossil content of the pyramid stones could help date their quarrying. Fossils themselves cannot be dated directly, but the patina and mineral deposits on their surfaces can sometimes indicate how long the stone has been exposed since being cut. If some blocks were quarried and shaped thousands of years before the pyramid's accepted construction date, they could carry microscopic evidence of that earlier exposure, weathering layers, mineral intrusions, even ancient lichen growth patterns fossilized into the surface. Imagine finding a block deep within the pyramid, whose fossil-bearing surface shows erosion consistent with centuries of exposure before being placed in Khufu's structure. Such a discovery would mean that the pyramid's core is a patchwork of stone from different eras, each block a geological witness to a time before the Old Kingdom even existed. In that case, the Great Pyramid would be less a single unified project than the culmination of multiple building phases, spanning millennia, a literal geological palimpsest holding the memory of both vanished seas and vanished civilizations. 7. The tombs that shouldn't exist. South and east of the Great Pyramid lie rows of mastaba tombs belonging to high officials of the Old Kingdom, viziers, overseers, priests. These tombs are considered contemporary with Khufu's reign, but some of their deepest layers tell a stranger story. In certain mastabas, the lowest courses of stone are markedly different from the upper ones, older, more weathered, and cut with techniques that do not match the clean lines of 4th dynasty work. Odd fact, in Mastaba G4000, geologists have identified limestone blocks with fossil assemblages that come from strata not found on the Giza plateau at all, suggesting the stone was quarried from an unknown location and reused. Historians are still debating whether these anomalous lower courses were simply salvaged from earlier structures or whether they indicate the mastabas were built atop foundations far older than the Old Kingdom itself. If so, it could mean that when Khufu's officials claimed these plots, they were repurposing the ruins of an earlier necropolis. Imagine the political statement: high-status burials literally placed on the bones of a forgotten age, as if to inherit its power. Such reuse would also explain the occasional presence of inexplicable tool marks, patterns more consistent with pounding or cutting methods seen at sites like Abydos, or even in pre-dynastic megalithic structures. If these foundations could be conclusively dated, they might prove that the plateau was already a sacred burial ground for a culture whose name never made it into the hieroglyphic record, one whose memory was buried under the prestige of the pharaohs. 6. The desert's magnetic scar. To the untrained eye, the sand around Giza looks uniform, a sea of beige stretching into the horizon, but sensitive magnetometers tell a different story. In 2015, a team conducting a geophysical survey detected a massive subsurface anomaly north of the Sphinx, an elongated zone of unusually high magnetic readings running roughly east-west. Such anomalies can be caused by concentrations of ferrous material, iron-rich stone, ancient firing pits, or even metallic objects buried for millennia. Odd fact: the anomaly's shape and orientation bear a loose resemblance to the causeways connecting the pyramids to their valley temples, but no known structure occupies this space on the surface. Historians are still debating whether this is a natural geological feature or the buried remains of a colossal man-made platform or wall. If artificial, it could belong to an earlier construction phase of the plateau, one later abandoned or buried by drifting dunes. What makes this more intriguing is that ancient texts occasionally refer to the Wall of the Crow and other large stone structures near Giza that may have served ceremonial or defensive purposes. If the magnetic scar conceals such a construction, it might be one of the oldest built features on the plateau, possibly marking a sacred boundary long before the pyramids rose. Excavation would be difficult without disturbing modern infrastructure, so for now the anomaly remains a hidden outline under the desert's skin, like a fossilized bone waiting for the right paleontologist to unearth it. 5. The stone that hums deep inside the king's chamber. Visitors sometimes notice something strange. Certain sounds linger in the air longer than they should. Clap your hands, hum a note, or strike the granite sarcophagus, and the room seems to sing back at you. This is no accident of acoustics, it's a product of the chamber's exact dimensions and the resonant qualities of its Aswan granite, which contains quartz crystals capable of vibrating in response to sound. Odd fact: engineers have measured resonances in the chamber around 110 Hz, a frequency that interacts physically with the human body, making the chest cavity vibrate subtly when sustained. Historians are still debating whether this effect was an intentional part of the pyramid's design, or a happy coincidence of material and geometry. If intentional, it could suggest that the chamber was meant not only as a symbolic or burial space, but as an instrument, one that could be played by voice, chant, or even percussive sound. Ancient Egyptian ritual often involved music and vibration, and in many cultures specific frequencies were associated with healing, trance states, or communication with the divine. Imagine a ceremony inside the king's chamber thousands of years ago, torches flickering against the polished granite, a chorus of voices chanting in perfect unison, the walls themselves trembling with harmonic energy. In that moment, the pyramid would not just be a monument, it would be a living participant in the ritual, amplifying and shaping the sound into something felt as much as heard. Whether or not the builders understood the physics, they clearly understood the power of resonance, and the granite chamber still hums with that ancient intent. 4. The chamber beneath the paw. The Sphinx has stared eastward for thousands of years, its paws resting on the plateau as if guarding something beneath them. In the late 20th century, seismic surveys conducted by researchers from Florida State University detected a large rectangular cavity beneath the Sphinx's forepaws, measuring roughly 9 by 12 meters. The anomaly is deep enough to have remained untouched since antiquity, and its clean geometric outline suggests it is man-made, rather than a natural fissure. Odd fact. Ancient Egyptian texts speak of the House of Records, hidden in the sands of Giza, a repository of sacred knowledge from the first time when gods walked with men. While mainstream archaeologists dismiss a direct link between the cavity and such myths, the correlation fuels speculation that the chamber could contain artifacts or inscriptions predating the dynastic period entirely. Historians are still debating whether the cavity is an unfinished tomb, a storage vault, or part of an earlier temple complex buried by the shifting desert. What complicates the picture is that any excavation near the Sphinx is heavily restricted, both to preserve the monument and because of political sensitivities surrounding its heritage. If the chamber predates the Sphinx's recarving in Khafre's era, it could hold organic materials, wood, cloth, or papyrus, preserved in the dry climate for millennia. Imagine what it would mean if, in that sealed darkness, there were documents or carved stelae describing a Nile civilization thousands of years older than we think possible. Until someone is allowed to drill or tunnel into it, the chamber remains an unopened envelope from a sender lost to history. 3. The plateau's buried city. Just south of the Sphinx lies an excavation zone that has yielded an astonishing find, the remains of a vast settlement that appears to have housed the pyramid builders themselves. Dubbed the Lost City of the Pyramid Workers, it includes long galleries that may have been dormitories, bakeries with enormous bread ovens, and vast quantities of animal bones, evidence of an industrial-scale food supply. But here's where it becomes strange. Beneath the Old Kingdom layers, there are hints of even older occupation, stone foundations and post holes that don't match the layout of Khufu's workforce camp. Odd fact, some of these deeper features have pottery sherds with styles and paste compositions not seen in known 4th Dynasty material culture, suggesting they could be centuries, even millennia older. Historians are still debating whether these earlier structures are from a pre-Khufu settlement that was wiped away to make room for the pyramid project, or whether they are part of a continuous habitation stretching back into the pre-dynastic period. If the latter is true, it means the Giza Plateau was already a hub of organized labor and engineering skill before the pharaohs began their pyramid-building campaigns. That would support the idea that Khufu and his successors were inheriting, not inventing, massive-scale construction traditions. Imagine uncovering the full sprawl of this earlier city, workshops for shaping stone, shrines aligned to an older sky, streets worn smooth by feet long gone. It would recast the plateau, not as a place suddenly transformed by royal ambition, but as a sacred and strategic center with a deep layered history, a city beneath a city, waiting for the sands to give it back. The black vault beneath Khafre's pyramid. Khafre's pyramid, the one guarded by the Sphinx, has always stood in the shadow of its larger neighbor, but beneath its massive bulk lies one of the strangest and most unsettling features in all of Giza. Deep underground, reached only by a long descending passage, there is a subterranean chamber, unlike any other in the complex. Cut directly into the bedrock, it contains a rectangular pit sunk even deeper into the floor, large enough to hold a sarcophagus, or something far larger, but no coffin has ever been found there, and the chamber's rough, unfinished surfaces contrast sharply with the precision of the pyramid above. Odd fact, the pit's walls are stained with a black, mineral-rich deposit, unlike the surrounding limestone, as though water or some other liquid once pooled there for a long period. Historians are still debating whether this black vault was an abandoned burial chamber, a symbolic underworld, or something inherited from a structure far older than Khafre's reign. The depth and difficulty of access suggest it was meant to be hidden and protected, but its apparent lack of decoration defies every known funerary convention of the Old Kingdom. If this chamber predates the pyramid above it, the black mineral crust could hold microfossils, plant remains, or even chemical residues that tell us what once filled the pit. Imagine if it had held offerings, or objects meant not for the dead, but for the gods, or perhaps for the preservation of something across ages of flood, drought, and shifting empires. Today the chamber is silent, its darkness broken only by the beam of a flashlight, the air cool and still, as though waiting for the moment when someone finally understands why it was carved in the first place. 1. The hidden core of the Great Pyramid. For all the surveys, theories, and legends, the single most staggering possibility beneath the sands of Giza may not be an undiscovered chamber or city, but the idea that the Great Pyramid itself is only the final layer of something far older. Some architectural anomalies hint at a core structure buried within, blocks with weathering patterns inconsistent with the rest of the monument, irregular angles in the inner passageways, and foundation cuts that extend beyond the footprint of the existing pyramid. Odd fact, in the 1980s, Japanese and Egyptian teams conducted a microgravimetric survey of the pyramid and detected dense irregular masses in the center that did not correspond to mapped internal spaces. While officially explained as variations in stone density, some engineers believe they could be remnants of a smaller earlier monument entombed within the present one. If true, this would mean Khufu's pyramid was not entirely new, it was a colossal renovation, an expansion that swallowed an older sacred structure whole. That inner pyramid could date to the wetter, greener Nile of the African humid period, perhaps aligned to a sky long shifted by precession. Inside it might still lie untouched chambers, tools or inscriptions from a people whose name we have never spoken. Imagine standing at Giza, knowing that inside the heart of the Great Pyramid, inside the stone mountain itself, there may be another, more ancient mountain of stone, built by hands that lived and died thousands of years before Khufu's name was ever carved. If that hidden core were ever revealed, it wouldn't just adjust Egypt's history, it would collapse and rebuild it, forcing us to accept that the greatest monument we know is merely the outer skin of a secret far older than civilization as we think we know it. So here we are, 20 layers deep into the sand, through chambers no one has entered in thousands of years, past rivers that no longer flow, skies that no longer match the stars, and stones that might have been old before Egypt was even Egypt. We've traced tool marks that shouldn't exist, followed shafts to nowhere, and stood at the edge of sealed doors with copper handles that haven't turned since the world was young, and yet, every single one of these clues is just that, a clue, not proof, not closure, just enough to make you wonder whether the truth is even stranger than the lies we've been told. Think about this. The Giza Plateau has been picked over for more than 2 centuries by explorers, looters, archaeologists and tourists, and still, the ground-penetrating radar pings with anomalies, the muon scans light up with hidden voids, and the desert keeps coughing up pieces of a puzzle that doesn't fit the picture in our textbooks. If this is what we've found while barely scratching the surface, what's still buried? What's still sealed so deep that even time hasn't pried it open? Maybe one day the Sphinx's hidden chamber will be drilled, or the void in the Great Pyramid will be breached, or some freak storm will strip the sand from an entire lost structure. Maybe, but what happens if the truth we find doesn't just extend history, it breaks it? If it shows that the pharaohs were not the beginning of Egypt's glory, but the inheritors of something older, something we've forgotten how to imagine? The sand is patient, the stone is patient. They've waited through floods, droughts, conquests and collapse. They can wait a little longer, and when they finally decide to give up their secrets, the world we think we know will shift under our feet quietly, suddenly, and without mercy. Until then, the pyramids will stand under their thin skin of moonlight, pretending to be what we think they are, while hiding what they have always been.